But now we need to talk about how does the contents of existence actually work, and can we describe it in a particular way that gives us some useful knowledge about the information of our brain, or the information of all of reality, the contents. What these categories allow us to do is to look at any kind of system, any kind of information, and to break it down into kind of a model about how information interacts and operates within our reality. Assuming that the information in that category exists in reality, we will see the function arise out of that category or information, and what that means is that we're seeing action in reality occurring as a result of the information in the category that we've described. Most of the videos that I've been doing so far have been pretty abstract in the topics that I've been talking about. So, it's more about existence, consciousness, how we exist, why we exist, the deterministic reality, what I believe in. But let's try to focus more on, the reality that we actually exist as this brain, right? Like within the context of our existence as a brain, what principles or what structure can we use to better describe how we operate and how we should or could do things in particular ways. So if we were wanting to optimize some kind of behavior, or if we want to describe how we operate so that we can do some particular thing with how we operate, we have to have some kind of description or some system or function about how we operate. Let's generalize first. So we're not going to think about the brain. We're going to think about just any content in general, right? And as I've talked about several times before, what the structure is we necessarily have some kind of existence. In order for existence to exist, it must have some kind of content. There must be something existing. And in order for the something to truly exist, there must be some acknowledgement from the existence of the content existing, right? So that's the data structure that I use as my explanation for how things exist, and in a similar way how consciousness exists. But we're going to be focusing entirely on the contents. So we've already explained existence itself through the brackets. We've already explained consciousness through the acknowledgement. But now we need to talk about how does the contents of existence actually work, and can we describe it in a particular way that gives us some useful knowledge about the information of our brain, or the information of all of reality, the contents, right? So what I have done is I've broken the contents of this structure down into three constituent parts. So any content in the universe we can describe as information. So essentially what that means is that it exists in some parameterized way with contents that are analogous in the exact same thing as being stated as information. So the content is information. But when we analyze information, what we can kind of take out of it, what we can see in every single piece or range or set of information that we have from any perspective, is three things that I use to kind of structure information. So we have the information itself, right? So in the information, there's content of the content, which is the content. And then we can describe that information as having some function, right? So information doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it doesn't do anything when it exists. There's necessarily, in order for the information to exist, there must be some functionality of that information. It is doing something, it is acting on something else, it is interacting with information alongside it, around it, or in any other part of the universe in some particular way that we can describe through some kind of function, right? And then what we would describe as information that has some function as occurring as action. We're not actually saying anything new. So in the exact same way that I consider this entire structure to be a singular thing or one thing that requires all constituent parts that aren't actually separated as we think like geometrically, but are instead the same exact thing, we can similarly think that these three descriptions of information are just repeating exactly what information is, right? We're not increasing the scope of what we're actually describing here with information. Everything about information falls into these three categories, essentially is what I'm saying. What these categories allow us to do is to look at any kind of system, any kind of information, and to break it down into kind of a model about how information interacts and operates within our reality. So let's take some examples and see if we can kind of get this to be a little easier to understand. So let's talk about, let's say, H2O. So we have one hydrogen bonded with two oxygen ionically, supposedly based upon my information. I might be wrong. And what we're saying is that the information about the system is here, right? So all the information that I've just stated about H2O is described in this thing, in this example here. But the information or the kind of state of the information is what we're describing here, right? So this is the information. What arises from the information, because we have the information, is that when we take a bunch of, or when we take the information being the content of H2O and we have it interact with any other particle or any other anything, right? There is some function that arises out of the information of H2O existing in a particular way. So that is to say that we can have, we can have the different forms of matter of H2O. So we have like gas, we have like a liquid, and these could be described as particular functions of the information of H2O, right? So from the content or the information of H2O existing in reality, we get some particular function, which we could describe as, say, the different forms that H2O takes, or the different ways it interacts with the reality around it. And then from the function, we can describe some action occurring. So the basic way that we can think about this is that there exists some possibility or some configured ability of information in reality to give us this particular set of information, right? Which is H2O, the form of H2O. From this particular configurability of information in reality, we can determine, or we can expect, a set of functions arising out of that content or that information existing. And then from that function, what we will see is action, is particular sets of behavior that are arising out of the function, since the information in that particular configuration exists in that way. And what this allows us, what we're doing essentially is we are analyzing systems and we're breaking them down into kind of three fundamental aspects about them. And now if we analyze different systems, we're able to talk about the amounts of each of these things, right? So let's move on to the next example to kind of talk about why it's important to separate these three things and to talk about them in this way. So if we talk about a system with a low amount of information, so for example, let's say there's no way in physical reality to construct a particle that exists such that there are, let's just say, bonds in a particular way like this. And let's just say that whatever this atom is something that can't be bonded with hydrogen in this particular configuration, right? So that is to say that there is a low amount of information or content in the universe that arises this particular structure of information, or this particular arrangement of information in the universe, right? And then from that, what we would see is that there wouldn't arise really like any function, because we don't have the content or the information in the universe that is present in this particular configuration, right? And so because of that, we wouldn't see any function. And because of the lack of function, we wouldn't see any action. But if we have a high amount of information or a high amount of content that exists in the universe in this particular configuration, then we're going to see the function arising out of that configuration. Okay? And then it follows that action would follow from that if there is an actual piece of information that represents the content that we're talking about, and then it would function within the realms of its like spatial and time expanse, and then it would create action, essentially, right? But now let's think about, so instead of having a lack of information, let's say that this structure does exist in the universe, right? But let's say that we are expecting or we want it to function in a particular way, but although it necessarily creates some kind of function, but that function is dependent upon the information content and what it can actually do. So if our expectation is that this structure or this information structure essentially is functioning in a particular way that we want it to or expect it to, if the function is low, then it's not actually going to function in the way that we expect it to, or it's not going to function in the way that we want it to. So the function is occurring as a result of the information and the content being present, but it only functions and operates in the way that the content and information allows it to, right? There's a limitation on the function, and it can't be anything beyond what it actually does. Or let's say that like the function in this case is that maybe we want it to become a liquid, let's say, right? So we want it to be in a particular form of matter, but for whatever reason, the function of this information in this configuration doesn't really ever become a liquid. That would be to say that we have a low functionality of this content, of this information, that allows it to become liquid, right? To perform some function that we expect or would like it to perform. And so, of course, no action is going to arise out of the function that we are expecting or deriving or attempting to find. And it could be that, like, let's say, like, all function of the object, or not object, but of the information structure that we have here is operating at a particular like wellness of how the information in this is set, right? So we can think of information like a category of thing, right? So we don't necessarily have that category existing in the universe at any place or at any time, but we can imagine that category, and from that category we can derive some kind of function. But let's say we have the category of this kind of element or this kind of molecule existing, and it can exist within that category in slightly different ways, right? So the content within the information is defined by some category that we're defining arbitrarily. And then within that category, there is some space to define it slightly differently than the other. So let's say that we have like an ionized H2O molecule, but we still consider it H2O. It's still considered water, right? And in that case, the function of this particular category is going to be slightly changed or altered, right? And so the information is going to dictate the kind of the functionality or the amount of function that is arising out of the content or the information that we're categorizing. Because, you know, from like a super high level perspective, there is no such thing as category, in my opinion. I'm a non-dualist, so that's how I see things. But you know, so in order to have a thing, we must necessarily categorize some box around it, or we must place it inside of kind of this idea of a single individual thing or category. And then once we've defined that thing or category, we can start describing, you know, because the category is like the information of the content, and then we will start seeing some kind of function arising out of the category or the function that we've defined. And then assuming that the information in that category exists in reality, we will see the function arise out of that category or information. And what that means is that we're seeing action in reality occurring as a result of the information in the category that we've described, right? And so finally, we can have in this example, we can have, let's say, it does become water very well, right? But let's say that so the category of this molecule exists, and as a result of that, the function of it becoming water is a reality and a possibility. But let's say there's no conditions in which we place this category of information or content into that actually gives us the liquid form of it, right? So there's no, like, although the function and the category and the possibility of the action of water occurring not water, but of a liquid form of this molecule exists, we don't actually ever find, or we don't have in our current perspective, a reality of it becoming water. That is to say that the action of it becoming water, or the action of the function, which is it being water, never arises in the reality or the context of the reality that we care about occurring. So that's to say that, like, there's a possibility of function of any particular category of information, but the action that's actually occurring at a particular place at a particular time, when we see that category within space or time, only a particular set of actions is occurring out of that category of information. So this is the very, like, precise and kind of low-level understanding of this three-part diagnosis of how systems and mechanisms work within reality. It's just kind of breaking everything down into different important aspects of how information is constructed, right? So there's the fact that the content within the category is, possible. There is the function that arises out of the possibility of that content. And then in any kind of perspective that we're looking at the category of that information, we should be seeing, or we will see, an action arising out of that category of information that operates based upon the function, or that is doing things based upon, as defined by the function, as defined by the category of information that's existing. Okay. So again, like I was saying before, we're all saying one thing. This is just information, right? So even though we're breaking it down into three constituent parts, it's still just the exact same thing that we're referring to. Putting it in the context of honesty, value, and strength makes it a lot more intuitive than putting it in the context of information, function, and action. But when we are describing the constituent parts as we use them with honesty, value, and strength, just remember that what I'm really talking about is an analysis of systems from this previous understanding that we've derived that comes from simply breaking down the content of reality into, information. Information is a category of some possibility of structure of information, but then from that arises function, that from the function placed in a certain environment will cause some kind of action.